For Shortland.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'm pleased to make a contribution on the Services Australia Governance Amendment Bill 2020. Now, Services Australia, the old DHS, is a crucial government department for all Australians. Every single person in Australia relies on the information services they offer, from people making claims for payments, families having a baby, to those needing help in an emergency. Despite this, the coalition government has proven time and time again how little it thinks of this fundamentally important government department. While no one could have predicted the COVID-19 pandemic, Australians, including Services Australia employees, were let down during this extremely challenging period due to the government's inability to take swift action when the threat was identified. Centrelink, one key part of Services Australia, has undergone an unprecedented surge of customers over the last 6 months. The footage and images of people lining up out the front of Centrelink at the start of this crisis was devastating. It's something I hope we will never see again. It's one of the many reasons Labor urges the government to extend the JobKeeper wage subsidy and return it to its previous level. If they don't, if it ends too soon, we will see these heartbreaking images again because more people will lose their jobs. Scenes like this are a reminder of the Great Depression of the 1930s and should not be repeated in the 21st century. Now, of course, while COVID-19 changed our lives so quickly, there's no doubt Australians were let down by the Minister for Government Services bungling the Centrelink response. The government declared COVID-19 a pandemic in late February. Lockdown, social distancing, the introduction of JobKeeper and an increase to the job seeker base rate were looming. Yet weeks later, when it was clear the devastation the crisis would have on our nation, the minister still had not bolstered Services Australia. They simply did not have the necessary resources to support Australians in their time of need. This resulted in those queues out the front of Centrelink and the MyGov website crashing. And what did the minister do as a result? Instead of admitting he'd stuffed up, he blamed it on invisible hackers, Mr Deputy Speaker. It was disgraceful. These invisible hackers were the cause of the MyGov website crashing, not the minister's own incompetence. And not long after that, he was forced to admit that it was his fault, that he did not anticipate the demand for Centrelink services. And what was his response? What was his deep apology to the Australian people? My bad, were his exact words. My bad. This is a Minister of the Crown, Mr Deputy Speaker, making a glib response to the huge stress and anxiety that he placed on so many people, hundreds of thousands of Australians, in one of the most stressful periods of their lives. My bad. I'm sure that was music to the ears of the hundreds of thousands of Australians who suddenly, through no fault of their own, had lost their job. This complete lack of preparedness and poor implementation is not a surprise from this government. The Prime Minister is great with good news and spinning half-truths, such as we saw recently with the so-called vaccination deal, which was no deal at all. But when we have to respond to a serious situation promptly and efficiently, he and his ministers display atrocious incompetence. They are all photo-op and no follow-up. To quote the Prime Minister, he doesn't hold a hose. And he didn't hold a hose, he didn't help Service Australia during this period. And Mr Deputy Speaker, of course, it just wasn't the website and Centrelink officers that were inundated. In the fortnight from 23 March, there were 6.5 million busy signals, 2 million congestion messages, 1.5 million unanswered calls, and an average call wait time of over 40 minutes. Many groups of Australians were impacted by this. The hotline for parents and families had 2.3 million attempts by busy signals. Almost 300,000 inquiries to the Older Australians hotline were met with a busy signal, while only 37,711 people got through to speak with someone. And the Basics card inquiries had an average wait time of well over an hour, with many of these card holders having no other source of income to rely upon. Imagine how stressful this would have been, Mr Deputy Speaker, in this period for someone like this, who had no other income but could not get through to speak to someone at Centrelink. The number of answered calls were comparable to other reporting periods and did not significantly increase until after April 20, signalling that capacity in this area was not sufficiently ramped up to meet the needs of Australians until 4 weeks after the initial hit on unemployment. So the minister's "my bad" isn't good enough. It never was good enough. It was such a glib assertion, but people might have copped it, Mr Deputy Speaker, if he immediately leapt into action and solved the problem. Instead, we had another 4 weeks of chaos and lack of response. It wasn't good enough for Centrelink staff, who were inundated with inquiries, subjected to abuse from very many stressed Australians. And it certainly wasn't good enough for the Australians who were desperate for assistance, including the many constituents who contacted my office in desperation and often in a state of high anxiety because they could not make contact with Centrelink. Just after the lockdown was announced in late March, a distraught father called my office on behalf of his son, both of whom had been trying for days to speak with someone at Centrelink. The son hadn't even been able to apply for JobSeeker because he hadn't been able to get a customer reference number, the dreaded CRN. The father was exasperated by the situation. His exact words were, "Can't you see that this situation is thoroughly unacceptable?" All my electorate officer who was trying to assist him was able to say was that of course it was, and that government should have had a better system in place to deal with the sheer volume of applications. This was predictable, Mr Deputy Speaker. The minute lockdowns were contemplated by the National Cabinet, the government and the minister should have leapt into action and ensured that Centrelink had the adequate staffing resources to answer the massive flood of calls and visits that were coming. And of course, Mr Deputy Speaker, this isn't the first time that the government did not anticipate the potential for our social security infrastructure to become strained during this pandemic. With COVID-19 taking off overseas long before it reached Australia, the government had months to prepare for increased demand at Centrelink, but they have a history of this lack of preparation. Past IT systems unpreparedness, such as the MyGov outage at the 2019-20 tax return time and the 2016 census debacle, show the government has not learned from its previous mistakes, and it's the Australian people who suffer as a result. In fact, such is this government's lack of shame about their own incompetence, the one response you get from the Prime Minister when a minister stuffs up is to promote them. Let me repeat that. Minister McCormack, after the census debacle, you think that would have been grounds for sacking. Instead, the National Party room in their wisdom, with the support of the Prime Minister, made him Deputy Prime Minister. This is the quality of the contributions from the government ministers. I look forward to where Minister Robert ends up after his my bad moment. The government also has so little regard for Services Australia that they have failed to listen to their advice. Take the robo-debt scandal, for example. Services Australia told Cabinet in February this program was no longer viable and called for it to be scrapped. But it wasn't until May, 3 months later, that the Minister finally admitted that 377,000 Aussies were ripped off by the Morrison government through this scheme, and that the government would refund people $721 million. Not only was this scheme the most expensive defrauding or theft of Australians by a government, it also had devastating, unforgivable impacts on their victims. If the government had any respect for Services Australia or Australians in general, you thought they would have announced their mistake in February. Instead, they ignored the advice from Services Australia and buried their heads in the sand for 3 whole months, choosing only to come clean when there was a threat of significant legal action hanging over their heads. It was disgraceful. I finally want to turn to what the impact of 7 years of coalition government and the implementation of their Conservative ideology has had on Services Australia and the many millions of Australians, ranging from students and single mothers to aged pensioners who rely on it. They've borne the brunt of the government's radical right-wing agenda. The Coalition came to office in 2013, and as they did in 1996, with a plan to slash and burn the public service, and have implemented this agenda with chilling efficiency, sacking tens of thousands of public servants. What Conservatives don't ever understand is that the government cannot provide public services without public servants. Yep. And the Coalition members who represent regional areas like mine, such as the members for Lyne and the member for Robertson, should explain to their constituents why the government they are part of has made it more difficult for Australians to access public services, like Services Australia. The rebranding of the Department of Human Services as Services Australia couldn't have come at a worse time for the government. And what are the impacts of cutting employees at Services Australia over the past 7 years? I'll tell the House. Many of my constituents, particularly elderly constituents who have applied for the age pension, waited months and months for their applications to be processed. One lady at Cardiff contacted my office in desperation, after a pension application had not been processed after 6 months. It was only when my office became involved that the application was approved. And this was not before the constituent had to use up nearly all the savings she'd worked so hard for over the course of her working life. There was also a gentleman from Charlestown who, whilst waiting over 4 months for his pension to be processed, actually had to go back to work in order to ensure that he could afford the basic necessities. And when his application was approved, the department transferred the money into the wrong bank account, and he had to wait until the bank processed a reversal before he finally received the pension. Mr Deputy Speaker, my office, like every electorate office in this country, particularly the Labor ones, has had to intervene in case after case to get applications resolved. I remember a case around youth allowance where a young student going to uni had to wait over 9 months to get their youth allowance approved. And Centrelink wasn't waiting for documents, they weren't waiting for further confirmation. As in almost all these cases, Mr Deputy Speaker, it was a lack of staffing that caused a delay, not any miscommunication, not a lack of documents. Centrelink physically do not have the staff to do their job that they are being asked to do because of this government's cuts. And you see that in the customer service approach that we see in the concrete bricks and mortar Centrelink offices. If you go into a Centrelink office, you're instantly steered towards a computer or sent back out. You have to actually insist quite stridently that you want to talk to a human being. And this isn't because Centrelink staff aren't trying to do their best, but they physically don't have the staff to handle the level of customer inquiries. Every single community assembly I have, every single seniors expo I had pre the COVID crisis, the #1 complaint was the lack of access to a human being at Centrelink to process pension applications, to answer simple questions. If you're applying for a pension and you're 66 or 67, it's very daunting to be referred to a computer, especially if you've come from an industry that hasn't used IT like that. It's very daunting to be told to go and get a CRN and then lodge all the documents online and then hope that it gets processed in time. It is unacceptable, Mr Deputy Speaker. I still maintain that in a rich and developed country like Australia, it is a fundamental human right to actually be able to speak to a human, preferably in person, when you need assistance from the government. I actually think it's a reasonable proposition for people who've paid taxes all their lives to, if they're unable to use a computer or they don't have the resources to access a computer or the internet under the government's so-called NBN, to speak to a human being. I think it shows the out-of-touch nature of so many coalition ministers that they don't understand that not everyone was born with access to these services or are familiar with these services. Many of my constituents, be they in Windale or San Remo or places further afield, aren't comfortable with using computers. They would like to speak to a human. And if they've worked the whole life, I think it's an entirely reasonable proposition to say, I would like to speak to a human to get help with my pension application, or to answer a simple question around family tax benefits. Unfortunately, under this government's ideology, where they haven't seen a public servant they didn't want to cut, where they haven't seen a service they didn't want to defund, it is unlikely to change. And so, Mr Deputy Speaker, we come back to the origins of this bill, which is principally about rebranding from a government obsessed with branding, not delivering, not implementing, but branding. Not a surprise that it's led by Scotty from marketing. The Prime Minister, I withdraw, I will use his correct title. They're very sensitive about it. The Minister at the table was very keen. Well, you're very sensitive. You're very sensitive about it.
Order.
He was ready to leap out of the table
to
note that the Prime Minister is all about marketing. I'll respect him when he respects the Australian people, and he doesn't respect the Australian people when he's all about the photo-op and not the follow-up. He does not give an inch of concern for the Australian people. It's all about pursuing power, staying ahead with spin, and that's what this bill is sadly about, rebranding rather than delivering the real services for Australians. We've really touched a nerve here. The two Liberal members in this chamber know I'm right, and that's why they're objecting so fiercely. Mr Deputy Speaker, they're very, very sensitive. They're very, very sensitive, and that goes to the root of this government. It is all about spin. It is all about marketing. It is not about serving the Australian people and providing the services they need. And I say shame on them for that.
Order.